of the Harris moves, the coming to terms with the unit that you're just in the middle of teaching, and we should explain to people who are just seeing the video rather than like me seeing your whole class that the larger unit is one in which students are looking at narrative in relation to the outsiders, and this particular week of instruction has been looking at how to use evidence from the text in order to support a claim about that text. So
yes,
it's all yours.
Okay, so students have been learning about plot and narrative and certain elements in narrative in terms of such things as character and how to classify those things. At Castellero, the students are very accustomed to performance-based assessments. We have a lot of dancers, a lot of people in sports, a lot of people who do extracurricular activities, but we also have students who prefer to socialize, students who prefer to engage in their family life and with their communities rather than pursuing academic goals, if you will.
Right.
And one of the reasons why I thought using evidence to help them with their understanding of narrative is because students, I think, really benefit from being able to think out loud. And looking for evidence, it's kind of another way of not talking per se, but expressing themselves. They have to find the evidence that they think supports their point, that shows that the inference they made from their reading is correct. It forces them to look at it in a logical way, in a way that I think shows a deeper understanding rather than guessing, rather than relying on what they hear from other people.
Right.
Of course, they can incorporate other people's opinions into their claims, into the reasoning that they use when they're finding evidence, but going back to the text is a really fundamental skill that the students will need to use all through high school. And even with narrative, like it's something that will be very closely related as they move forward academically.
Right. What I had mentioned last time we had this discussion was that making a claim or coming to a conclusion as you're reading a narrative was a little different from coming to a conclusion on the basis of a short story that you'd read or a news article that you'd read, in the sense that the conclusion you came to was almost by definition a tentative conclusion, because after all you didn't know what was going to happen next. So a conclusion that you might come to about a character or even a character's trait might be, you might say, usefully modified or usefully complicated by what you had read later. And I was wondering if that type of thinking about the difficulty of coming to fixed final conclusions in a narrative, whether that might have led you to choose to use the Associated Press article for today's class. Because it was
I wish that I could say that I had, and that I could take credit for such a wonderful piece of thinking. But that wasn't really my goal. When I decided to use the news article, it was really my hope to get their attention. About a third of the students here are considered at risk, and the other 2/3, if they're not, I would say not 2/3 of them, but there are a good number of students who attempt to fly under the radar, I think. And I know that with middle school students there's a lot of concern about what's appropriate to introduce to them and for them to learn about. And I thought that these students were ready to know about some of these things that go on. I had a conversation with a group of students in the library a couple of weeks ago, and one of the students had told me that he lives in a gang-riddled neighborhood, and he's been exposed to like drugs and violence in his community, and it's very real for him.
Right.
And showing the students consequences in a real way with the news article, I think, shows them, you know, these are real consequences. These happen to people. This is a real article.
Right.
So from a pedagogical point, that wasn't really my intention. It was really more of making a connection with them, hoping that they would take the text and what it had to say to heart, and then, I guess as a bonus, the evidence.
And we should explain, just for people watching the video who don't know the article, that this is an article from a court case that was just decided last June in Provo, Utah, about a then 17-year-old girl who had assisted her much older boyfriend, I guess mid-30s boyfriend, as he was attempting to evade, not so much capture as just being indicted for traveling without a warrant, and killed a policeman, and then she assisted him in fleeing in his getaway car. And she was, in fact, indicted for aggravated murder.
Aggravated
life imprisonment.
Assault.
Well, I think it said aggravated murder at the end. Yeah, I was a little surprised. But yeah, aggravated assault isn't something that would give you life imprisonment.
No, it wouldn't.
But aggravated murder is. It's,
I think it was 30 years to life.
Yeah. Oh, I see. 30 years to life. Yeah. Right. I didn't follow that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Good. So looking then, there are two questions. What do you hope to do with the article as you come back to it 2 days from now to complete? What do you hope to stress, and then what do you hope the value of the work on the article will be as the students return to the outsider's narrative?
Well, our district assessment is for the students to read a short story and to identify a character trait that one of the characters in the story has and support their inference with direct quotations from the article. They have to have evidence, and they have to explain the evidence and why that evidence is important to their point. Right. Keeping that assessment in mind, I wanted to build a skill for them that they could use for that assessment and later. I think the skill of using evidence to support your point is something that's transferable between different areas of writing. Right. On Monday and Tuesday they used a poem, and they wrote about the tone of the poem. They wrote that they believed that the tone was either sad or anxious, and they gave evidence from the poem, including word choice, to show that their conclusion was correct. Right. And the poem was, of course, embedded in. Yeah, it was from The Outsiders. Nothing Gold Can Stay by Robert Frost. The Robert Nothing Gold Can Stay. Yeah. So with the article, it's less artsy. It's a little bit more real for the students who maybe didn't take the poem's message to heart. And I think my biggest concern with the students is drawing them in, because if they're invested, then they'll learn the skills, they'll learn the content that will help them later. Right. And how will you determine whether or not being able to do this with a news article transfers to being able to do this in the district-wide assessment with a short story in relation to a trait of a character? I think to determine that, I would have to compare the two assessments, how they did on their assessment with the news article and how they did with this short story that they will have never read before. Right. So of course there is a bit more scaffolding with my assessment. They will have the news article, they will have read it before they take the assessment. Right. They will have seen the rubric with which I will be scoring their paragraphs. Right. And they will be allowed to use a Says Means Matters chart, which will hopefully allow them to visualize the information that they need to include in the paragraph.
Right, the graphic organizer
Yes.
that you've had them use. That
They
says
won't have those things.
a
with
column
it.
with says,
Yeah.
a column with means, and a column with why it
Yeah,
matters.
if-
Yeah,
yeah.
right,
Yes.
just to clarify.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, so they won't have those, you might say, instructional assistants, because they'll be doing the
Yes,
assessment
yes.
entirely on their own. But they will have the knowledge of how those instructional aids help them in responding to the article from
That's the
Provo,
hope.
Utah. Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
hope, yes.
Good, good. Well, thank you very much, Krista. That's a very helpful explanation, and hopefully this has been helpful to you in clarifying the
Yeah.
role of the Provo article in relation
Yes.
to